My cousin mocked me for living paycheck to paycheck, so I let her explain her bankruptcy to the family. Growing up, my cousin Victoria was the golden child who could absolutely do no wrong in anyone's eyes. While I worked nights at a grocery store stocking shelves, mopping floors, and dealing with drunk college students to pay for community college tuition, she got a full ride to an expensive private university courtesy of uncle and aunt's seemingly bottomless trust fund. While I drove a beat-up Chevy Cavalier with rust spots eating through both doors, a muffler that sounded like a dying lawnmower, and a passenger window permanently stuck halfway down, Victoria cruised around campus and town in a brand new white Lexus her parents bought her for graduation, complete with premium leather seats, a high-end sound system, and monthly insurance payments that exceeded what I paid for rent. Every single family gathering followed the exact same exhausting routine. Victoria would arrive fashionably late in designer clothes with tags carefully removed, but labels still strategically visible, carrying the latest designer handbags and accessories, making subtle but devastating observations about my thrift store wardrobe and my cramped studio apartment above Tony's Pizza Palace, where I worked weekends making minimum wage plus whatever tips the college crowd bothered to leave after their late-night pizza binges. She had this particular way of looking at me during family conversations, tilting her head slightly with the expression of fascinated concern, like I was some compelling specimen of working-class poverty she was studying for an advanced sociology research project or graduate thesis on economic inequality. The systematic comparisons between us started when we were just children at family birthday parties and holiday celebrations, and they never stopped escalating or becoming more pointed as we grew older, and our life paths diverged more dramatically. At family barbecues and holiday gatherings, Uncle would lovingly stroke Victoria's perfectly styled and professionally maintained hair while announcing her latest impressive achievements to all the assembled relatives, while I sat completely invisible in a folding lawn chair in the corner, picking at potato salad and pretending not to care about the obvious and systematic favoritism that everyone seemed to accept as natural. Full academic scholarship to the most exclusive prep school in the state, president of the student council with unanimous election, early acceptance to university with automatic admission to the honors program, Dean's List recognition every single semester without exception, leadership positions in multiple prestigious campus organizations, internship opportunities with major corporations that most students could only dream about accessing. Meanwhile, my more modest accomplishments: consistent honor roll recognition at the overcrowded public school, Employee of the Month awards at the grocery store where I worked nights, successfully completing another semester of part-time night classes without dropping out due to complete physical and mental exhaustion, were acknowledged with brief, polite nods before conversations quickly shifted to more impressive topics that didn't remind everyone present of the family's less successful and more financially struggling branches. "Oh, you're still completely committed to the whole struggling single woman authenticity experience?" she'd say with that particular condescending smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes at every holiday gathering we both attended. That's so refreshingly genuine and unpretentious in today's superficial and materialistic world. Almost inspiring in its determination, really. By the time we were both well into our 20s, the established family dynamic had solidified into something almost ritualistic and completely predictable in its cruelty. Victoria was pursuing her master's degree in business administration with a specialty in marketing, while living in a luxury downtown apartment featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, designer furniture, and a spectacular view of the city skyline that probably cost more per month in rent than I earned in 3 months of combined income from all my various part-time jobs and side hustles. I was grinding through 3 different jobs while taking night classes to finish my accounting degree, surviving primarily on cheap ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and the occasional free meal from the pizza place downstairs, when Tony felt particularly sorry for my obvious financial struggles and exhaustion. At every holiday celebration and family milestone event, Victoria would discover increasingly creative and pointed ways to highlight the growing and apparently insurmountable gap between our respective life circumstances, career prospects, and future potential for success and financial security. She'd inquire about my academic progress with the precise tone that most people reserve for discussing terminal cancer diagnoses or natural disaster recovery efforts. Concerned but carefully detached, like my situation represented both a genuine tragedy and something potentially contagious that might somehow spread to her if she showed too much direct sympathy or got too emotionally involved in my problems. Still managing to balance those challenging night classes with full-time work responsibilities, that schedule must be absolutely overwhelming and completely exhausting, she'd observe with perfectly performed false sympathy while examining her flawless manicure. I mean, when I was completing my undergraduate degree with honors distinction, I could barely imagine trying to maintain even a part-time work schedule while sustaining the kind of academic excellence that really matters for future opportunities. But then again, I was completely focused on much more intellectually demanding and rigorous coursework that required my absolute and undivided dedication to achieve the standards I set for myself. The subtext was always crystal clear to everyone listening and completely devastating in its implications. Her educational path was inherently superior, more challenging, more intellectually rigorous, and infinitely more likely to lead to meaningful professional success and financial independence. My desperate struggles weren't admirable examples of determination, perseverance, and work ethic. They were clear evidence of poor life planning, limited intellectual capabilities, inadequate family support, and a fundamental inability to secure the kind of advantages that distinguish truly successful people from those who are destined for lifelong mediocrity and financial insecurity. Last Christmas was particularly brutal and humiliating in ways that still made me cringe months later. I'd scraped together just enough money to bring homemade cookies that I'd stayed up until 3 in the morning baking in my tiny apartment kitchen, and a modest $25 restaurant gift card for the traditional family white elephant exchange. The kind of generic, uninspiring card you grab desperately at the grocery store checkout, when you suddenly realize you've completely forgotten about gift exchange requirements until literally the last possible minute. Victoria made her characteristically dramatic entrance carrying expensive imported wine that she made absolutely sure to mention had cost significantly more than my monthly car payment, along with luxury accessories and designer items still nestled in their exclusive boutique shopping bags with colored tissue paper artfully arranged inside like precious artifacts from some retail temple that people like me could never afford to even walk past without feeling inadequate. The entire extended family gathered around grandparents' massive antique dining room table, the same imposing mahogany piece that had witnessed decades of holiday meals, major family announcements, and generational power struggles that shaped our family's complex social hierarchy. The finest china was meticulously arranged according to grandmother's exacting standards. The family silver was polished to mirror brightness that caught and reflected the chandelier light, and the crystal glasses seemed to capture and refract light into tiny rainbow prisms that danced across the white tablecloth. During the main course, Victoria launched into her most elaborate performance yet, delicately cutting her prime rib with the precise technique of a trained surgeon and the calculated showmanship of a professional performer, working a completely captive audience that hung on her every carefully chosen word. Your little cousin is still absolutely committed to playing the struggling student role with such remarkable dedication and consistency, she announced to the entire table while gesturing toward me with her sterling silver knife like she was conducting an orchestra of family judgment and disapproval. Some people apparently just can't seem to successfully transition into handling genuine adult responsibilities and expectations, I suppose. It's genuinely fascinating from both psychological and sociological perspectives to observe such commitment to a particular lifestyle choice. Uncle nodded with obvious approval, like a proud teacher whose star pupil had just delivered a particularly insightful and well-articulated observation about human behavior and social dynamics, while Aunt practically glowed with unmistakable maternal pride, her face radiating satisfaction like Victoria had just announced she'd been selected for a Nobel Prize committee or appointed to a presidential cabinet position. My parents sat quietly and uncomfortably at the designated less prestigious end of the long table, relegated to the social margins by their own modest middle management careers and ongoing struggles with mortgage payments, credit card debt, and the kind of financial pressures that made them unwilling and unable to defend me against Victoria's systematic attacks on my character and life choices. Maybe if you develop some fundamental budgeting discipline and learn to prioritize long-term financial planning instead of continuously wasting money on completely unnecessary daily luxuries, like expensive coffee purchases, you could actually afford to buy nice things and live like normal, successful people do. Victoria continued with increasing confidence and obvious enjoyment, pulling out her latest iPhone model to display carefully curated and professionally filtered photos of her recent spa weekend in Napa Valley. The images showed her in luxurious resort settings that looked like they'd been lifted directly from travel magazines. Designer robes in marble bathrooms, gourmet meals arranged like works of art, wine tastings in vineyards where individual bottles cost more than I spent on groceries in an entire month, and spa treatments that exceeded my monthly rent payments for services I couldn't even pronounce correctly. It's really about understanding fundamental priorities and developing sophisticated long-term financial strategies that most people never bother to learn, she explained to her captive audience, with the authoritative tone of someone delivering a graduate-level lecture on economics and personal finance management. When you finally start thinking strategically and systematically instead of just barely surviving day-to-day in constant crisis reaction mode, you'll begin to understand how real wealth generation and sustainable asset accumulation actually function in today's complex economic environment. She scrolled through additional photos with the practiced timing of a professional presentation, expensive dinners at restaurants where I couldn't afford to read the menu through the windows, exclusive shopping trips to designer boutiques where sales associates probably earned more than my annual income, weekend getaways to luxury resorts where people spent more on room service than I paid for tuition each semester, and cultural events like opera performances and art gallery openings that represented a world I could only imagine accessing. Each carefully selected and professionally edited image represented a calculated monument to her superior lifestyle choices, financial success, and social status, specifically designed and strategically chosen to highlight everything I fundamentally lacked and would probably never be able to achieve given my obvious limitations, poor decision-making patterns, and complete lack of family financial support or inherited advantages. The assembled family members responded with appreciative laughter and approving murmurs at her astute observations about financial responsibility, social mobility, and the clear differences between successful and unsuccessful approaches to life management, even grandmother chuckling approvingly while shaking her head at my apparent combination of financial ignorance and stubborn refusal to learn from someone who was clearly more knowledgeable, experienced, and successful in navigating adult responsibilities. The sound echoed off the formal dining room walls like a carefully orchestrated chorus of family judgment and social rejection, confirming what everyone assembled already knew and had apparently accepted as unchangeable fact. Victoria represented our family's greatest success story and most promising future, while I embodied the cautionary tale of wasted potential, misguided priorities, and the inevitable consequences of poor planning and limited ambition. I smiled politely and nodded with practiced resignation, playing my assigned role in this familiar and painful family theater performance, with the kind of forced grace that comes from years of experience, letting her enjoy her moment of absolute triumph in the family spotlight, while I mentally calculated exactly how many hours of work at multiple minimum wage jobs I would need to complete just to afford the single elaborate meal we were currently consuming off China that individually cost more than my monthly grocery budget. What I didn't mention to anyone seated at that oppressive table was that I'd been working as a part-time bookkeeper for Victoria's landlord, Mr. Rodriguez, for the past 6 months. Mr. Rodriguez owned and managed several luxury rental properties throughout the downtown area and had specifically hired me to handle his accounting and tenant management after my accounting professor personally recommended me for the position based on my demonstrated competence with complex financial record-keeping systems, attention to detail, and reliability in handling sensitive financial information. The job paid reasonably well for a student position and provided invaluable real-world experience working with commercial real estate finances, rent collection procedures, credit checks, tenant screening processes, and the kinds of complex financial issues that property managers deal with on a daily basis in managing high-end rental properties. Through this professional position, I had complete access to detailed information about Victoria's rental situation, and I knew with absolute certainty exactly how much money she owed in accumulated back rent payments. 3 full months behind on her obligations, totaling exactly $9,600 in a luxury building where monthly rent was $3,200 for a 1-bedroom apartment with premium amenities including a full-time doorman, state-of-the-art fitness center, rooftop terrace with city views, and concierge services that most people could never afford to access. I'd personally witnessed and documented the increasingly desperate and frantic text messages she sent to Mr. Rodriguez at all hours of the day and night, promising rent payments that never materialized despite repeated deadlines, creating elaborate and increasingly creative excuses about temporary delays in trust fund distributions, short-term cash flow problems that would definitely be resolved within days, and family financial issues that were preventing her from accessing her usual funding sources. I also possessed intimate and detailed knowledge about her credit card situation, because Victoria had strategically and deliberately listed Mr. Rodriguez as a professional reference on multiple credit applications, and the various credit companies called our office regularly with increasing frequency to verify her claimed income levels, employment status, and financial stability. 8 different cards maxed out to their absolute limits with a combined outstanding balance exceeding $52,000. Each one being systematically used to make minimum payments on the others in an increasingly elaborate and unsustainable shell game of debt management and financial manipulation that was becoming more precarious with each passing month. The collection agencies had started calling our office too, with increasing frequency and escalating aggression that made Mr. Rodriguez genuinely concerned about potential legal liability. Mortgage companies where she'd submitted loan applications using completely fabricated income statements, employment histories, and financial information that bore no resemblance to reality. Auto financing companies desperately trying to track down missing payment records, verify insurance coverage, and locate collateral that may have been sold or hidden. Personal loan services that specialized in high-risk borrowers and charged interest rates that would make traditional organized crime operations seem reasonable and ethical by comparison. Most importantly, and most devastating for her carefully maintained public image and family reputation, I knew with absolute certainty that her parents had completely and permanently cut off her trust fund access exactly 3 months ago. Uncle had called Mr. Rodriguez directly and personally, his voice tight with barely controlled embarrassment, mounting anger, and what sounded like genuine betrayal, explaining in painful and humiliating detail that his daughter had been systematically lying to their entire family about her academic progress, degree completion, and professional prospects for over 18 months. Victoria had actually dropped out of her prestigious master's program after completing only the first semester, but had continued taking substantial monthly trust fund distributions while sending elaborate fake progress reports, professionally forged transcripts, and completely fabricated stories about internship opportunities, academic achievements, networking events, and job prospects to maintain the complex illusion of continued academic success and promising professional development that everyone in the family had accepted without question. For months, I'd been quietly observing Victoria's elaborate financial house of cards, becoming increasingly unstable and precarious, like watching a slow-motion disaster that everyone could see coming except the person at the center of it. Mr. Rodriguez had shown me the progressively more frantic and desperate communications from Victoria. Text messages sent at 3 and 4 in the morning promising payment plans that never materialized. Voice messages filled with increasingly creative and implausible explanations for her inability to meet even the most basic rent obligations, and written guarantees of family financial backing that everyone involved knew were completely fictional and legally meaningless. The spa weekend in Napa Valley that she'd used as the centerpiece for her Christmas dinner performance and social media documentation, she'd charged the entire expensive vacation to credit cards that were already over their limits, before she'd even made the reservations. including luxury resort accommodations, premium spa treatments, exclusive wine tastings, gourmet dining experiences, and transportation costs that individually exceeded what most people spend on their monthly car payments. But I'd maintained complete professional discretion and kept absolutely quiet about all of this privileged information, partly because of my ethical obligations to Mr. Rodriguez's privacy policies and client confidentiality requirements, and partly because some vindictive and admittedly petty part of my personality wanted to see exactly how long Victoria could maintain her increasingly expensive and unsustainable performance before harsh economic reality crashed through her carefully constructed facade of success, superiority, and financial independence. The next morning after Christmas dinner, Uncle called the entire extended family for an unprecedented emergency meeting at grandparents' house. We gathered in the same formal living room where we'd exchanged gifts and shared holiday toasts less than 24 hours earlier, but the atmosphere was completely transformed and ominous in ways that made everyone visibly uncomfortable and anxious. The Christmas decorations that had seemed festive and welcoming the previous evening now appeared grotesquely cheerful and inappropriately celebratory, like party decorations accidentally left up for a funeral service or memorial gathering. Everyone looked genuinely confused and increasingly concerned, whispering anxiously among themselves and repeatedly checking their phones for missed calls, text messages, or any additional information that might explain this sudden and completely unprecedented family emergency summons that had interrupted everyone's normal holiday plans and routines. Uncle's normally confident and controlled appearance had transformed dramatically overnight. His face appeared pale and drawn with new lines around his eyes that made him look like he'd aged an entire decade in just a few hours. His usually perfect posture had collapsed into something approaching complete physical defeat and emotional exhaustion. Aunt kept compulsively wringing her hands and dabbing at her red-rimmed, swollen eyes with tissues that she clutched desperately like lifelines in a storm. My parents sat together on the formal sofa with matching expressions of confusion and growing dread, holding hands with the desperate tension of people bracing for catastrophic news that they knew was coming but couldn't prepare for or prevent. Grandmother and grandfather occupied their usual matching antique armchairs, but instead of their normal holiday contentment and satisfied family pride, they both looked genuinely worried, suddenly much more frail than their actual years had previously suggested, and completely unprepared for whatever crisis was about to unfold. Victoria was conspicuously and ominously absent from this gathering, despite the fact that she'd been staying at her parents' house since Christmas Eve, and everyone had expected her to be present for whatever family business required this emergency meeting. Uncle cleared his throat repeatedly and took several deep, shuddering breaths before he could manage to speak coherently, his voice cracking and breaking like an adolescent boy attempting to deliver devastating news that was completely beyond his emotional capacity to process and communicate effectively. "We need to discuss Victoria's current situation immediately," he began, the words tumbling out in a breathless, panicked rush like he was afraid he'd completely lose his courage and ability to speak if he allowed himself to slow down or pause for even a moment of reflection or preparation. "We've just learned some extremely disturbing and frankly shocking information about her actual circumstances over the past year and a half. She's been systematically and deliberately lying to our entire family about school, about her living situation, about her finances, about essentially everything we thought we knew about her life and her future prospects." The room went completely silent except for the steady, hypnotic ticking of grandfather's antique mantel clock and the distant mechanical humming of the heating system cycling on and off in response to the winter cold outside. My grandmother reached desperately for grandfather's weathered and trembling hand, her face beginning to crumple and collapse as she realized that something genuinely terrible and potentially family-destroying was unfolding in real time before her eyes. "She never actually finished her master's degree program like she told us she did," Uncle continued, his voice gaining strength and volume but becoming increasingly bitter and angry with each devastating revelation he was forced to share. "She dropped out after completing only the first semester, but continued taking substantial money from her trust fund month after month for over a year. She's been sending us completely fake progress reports that she created herself, professionally forged transcripts that she paid someone to produce, and elaborately fabricated stories about internship opportunities, academic achievements, and job prospects that never existed. Every single thing she's told us about her academic and professional success over the past 18 months has been a carefully constructed and systematic lie designed to keep the money flowing and maintain her expensive lifestyle." Aunt started crying openly and uncontrollably now, the sound sharp and painful in the otherwise quiet room, like something precious breaking that could never be repaired or replaced, accompanied by the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from the complete destruction of fundamental beliefs about your own child and your family's future. "We don't even begin to know the full extent of the financial damage, legal exposure, and potential criminal liability yet," Uncle said, running both hands through his hair repeatedly, in a gesture of complete helplessness and mounting panic that was painful to witness. "But her landlord called us yesterday morning threatening immediate legal action for months of unpaid rent and property damage. There are credit card companies calling our house phone at all hours of the day and night with increasingly aggressive collection demands. Professional collection agencies with threatening messages about legal action and asset seizure. Her car is being repossessed this afternoon by the financing company." My father spoke up carefully, his voice measured and cautious, like someone attempting to navigate a dangerous minefield of family emotions and potential financial catastrophe without triggering an even worse explosion. "Where is Victoria right now?" Have you been able to reach her or get any kind of explanation for what's been happening and how long this has been going on? Uncle shook his head with sharp, angry movements that spoke of complete frustration, bewilderment, and a kind of betrayal that cut deeper than financial loss. We have absolutely no idea where she is currently or how to contact her. When we confronted her yesterday afternoon about everything we'd learned from her landlord and the credit companies, she initially became extremely defensive and hostile, then completely unhinged and irrational when we showed her some of the evidence we'd gathered. She cleaned out her room during the middle of the night while we were sleeping and disappeared without any word of explanation, apology, or contact information for the future. She took whatever possessions she could fit in her car and vanished like she was fleeing some kind of criminal investigation or legal warrant. The family erupted in shocked exclamations and overlapping questions that filled the room with confused noise and desperate attempts to understand what was happening. How could something like this occur without anyone noticing obvious warning signs? How long had the systematic deception been continuing? Why hadn't educational institutions or financial companies contacted the family sooner with concerns about inconsistencies? The voices overlapped and competed in a growing chorus of panic and desperate need for answers that nobody present could provide. That's when I made the calculated decision that would fundamentally change everything about our family dynamics and my position within the family hierarchy. Actually, I said calmly, standing up from my chair in the corner where I'd been sitting quietly and observing the devastating family drama unfold like a slow-motion car accident, I think I might be able to help clarify some important aspects of the situation. Through my work, I have access to specific financial information that could be extremely useful in understanding the full scope and timeline of what's been happening. All eyes immediately turned toward me with an intensity I'd never experienced before, and for the first time in my entire life, I commanded the complete and undivided attention of my entire extended family without having to compete with Victoria's presence or achievements. Uncle looked genuinely skeptical and slightly annoyed, like he couldn't imagine what someone of my obviously limited experience and modest resources could possibly contribute to a crisis of this magnitude and complexity. I've been working as a professional bookkeeper for Mr. Rodriguez, who happens to be Victoria's landlord, for the past 6 months, I explained with deliberate calm and professional composure, while pulling my laptop bag onto the coffee table and opening it with practiced efficiency that demonstrated my competence and preparedness. Through this professional position, I have direct and complete access to all the detailed financial records related to Victoria's tenancy, her payment history, and the various credit inquiries and verification requests we've received about her claimed income and employment status. The room immediately erupted in surprised exclamations, rapid-fire questions, and expressions of amazement that I'd never seen directed toward me before. When had this professional working relationship started? Why hadn't I mentioned this connection to Victoria before now? How much did I actually know about her real financial situation? Aunt looked suddenly hopeful for the first time since I'd arrived. Like maybe I held some kind of key to solving this nightmarish situation that was systematically destroying their financial security, family reputation, and faith in their own parenting. I had spent the entire previous evening after Uncle's devastating phone call preparing a comprehensive and thoroughly professional presentation, exactly the kind of detailed financial analysis and documentation that I'd learned to create in my advanced accounting classes and through my work experience with Mr. Rodriguez. Multiple interconnected spreadsheets with color-coded categories and comprehensive supporting documentation, a complete chronological timeline of financial events and warning signs, and a thorough breakdown that painted an absolutely complete and undeniable picture of Victoria's systematic financial collapse and elaborate deception over many months. Victoria currently owes exactly $9,600 in accumulated back rent and associated late fees to Mr. Rodriguez, I began, clicking through to my first prepared slide and watching the specific numbers register with visible shock and impact on their faces. But that represents only the most immediate and visible portion of a much larger, more complex, and more serious financial crisis that has been developing over many months. I walked them through everything with methodical professionalism and careful attention to detail, the way I'd learned to present complex financial information to clients, business partners, professors, and other professionals who needed to understand complicated financial situations and make important decisions based on accurate data. The credit card statements and account information that Mr. Rodriguez had received when various companies called for routine employment verification and income confirmation. The numerous personal loan applications where Victoria had listed completely fabricated income figures, entirely fictional job titles with major corporations that had no record of her employment, and false references who didn't exist or had never heard of her. The gambling debts I discovered when an increasingly aggressive collections agent called our office multiple times and became threatening while looking for current contact information, claiming that Victoria owed money to several online gambling sites and had defaulted on payment plans for casino debts in multiple states. The luxury spa weekend in Napa Valley that she'd used as the centerpiece for her Christmas dinner performance and social media documentation had cost exactly $13,800 in total expenses, charged across 5 different credit cards that were already at their absolute maximum limits before she'd even made the initial reservations. Every aspect of the trip, the luxury resort accommodations, premium spa treatments, exclusive wine tastings, gourmet dining experiences, shopping excursions, and luxury transportation, had been paid for with borrowed money while she was already months behind on basic living expenses like rent, utilities, and minimum credit card payments. The expensive designer clothes, luxury accessories, and high-end electronic gadgets she'd been showing off at family gatherings throughout the past year, every single item had been purchased on credit with no realistic ability to pay and no serious intention of developing a sustainable payment plan or budget that would allow her to meet her obligations. The expensive restaurant dinners, exclusive nightclub experiences, cultural events, and luxury shopping trips she'd been posting about on social media to maintain her carefully crafted image of professional success and social relevance. Every single charge had been made with borrowed money from credit cards, personal loans, and cash advances, while she was simultaneously falling further behind on rent, utilities, insurance payments, and other basic adult responsibilities. Even the expensive imported wine she'd presented with such elaborate ceremony and pride at yesterday's Christmas dinner was shoplifted from a high-end liquor store 3 blocks from her apartment, I revealed while watching Uncle's face cycle through multiple expressions of disbelief, horror, mounting rage, and complete bewilderment at how thoroughly he'd been deceived by his own daughter. I know this specific fact because Mr. Rodriguez received a call from store security asking about Victoria's current address and contact information after they reviewed surveillance footage and positively identified her leaving the store without paying for merchandise on multiple occasions over several months. The receipt she'd casually left visible on the kitchen counter during Christmas dinner, the one she'd used to demonstrate how much money she'd supposedly spent on premium wine for the family celebration, was completely fake, printed from a template she'd downloaded from the internet and filled out with fictional purchase information to support her deception. By the time I finished presenting my complete and thoroughly documented analysis, the total verifiable damage exceeded $84,000 in various debts, unpaid obligations, stolen merchandise, and accumulated interest and penalties, not including the additional $38,000 in trust fund money she'd already spent while pretending to attend graduate school and maintain satisfactory academic progress toward her degree. Uncle looked like he'd aged 20 years during my 30-minute presentation, his face completely gray and slack with shock and the dawning realization of how completely, systematically, and deliberately he'd been deceived and manipulated by his own daughter over an extended period of time. "How long have you known about the extent of this situation?" Aunt asked me, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with tears and something that sounded like potential accusation or misplaced blame for not warning them sooner. "About 5 months for the basic rent problems and initial credit issues," I answered with complete honesty while maintaining professional composure and refusing to be defensive about my decision to maintain confidentiality. The complete financial picture came together gradually as more creditors contacted Mr. Rodriguez for verification of Victoria's claimed income and employment status, and as collection agencies became increasingly aggressive and threatening in their attempts to locate her and recover outstanding debts. The gambling debts and the extent of the credit card fraud only came to light 3 weeks ago, when multiple collections agents became threatening enough that Mr. Rodriguez asked me to document everything comprehensively for potential legal action and police involvement. "Why didn't you tell us about any of this sooner?" Grandfather asked, his voice carrying the full weight of disappointment, confusion, and something that might have been anger at what he perceived as a betrayal of family loyalty. I looked around the room at faces that had spent years systematically dismissing my achievements, laughing appreciatively at Victoria's cruel observations about my financial struggles and limited prospects, treating me like the family embarrassment who would never amount to anything significant or worthy of respect, and accepting without question that I was somehow inferior to their golden child in every measurable way. Because until yesterday evening's dinner conversation and performance, I genuinely believed that Victoria might be experiencing some temporary financial difficulties or cash flow problems that she would resolve with family help, I said, choosing each word carefully and watching their faces as they processed the full implications of what I was telling them. Everyone faces financial challenges and temporary setbacks sometimes, and I naturally assumed that her strong family support system would help her work through whatever difficulties she was experiencing without needing intervention from someone outside the immediate family. I paused deliberately, letting that carefully constructed statement hang in the air for several long seconds while they absorbed the full meaning and implication. But when she spent Christmas dinner delivering a detailed lecture about financial responsibility, budgeting strategies, and wealth-building techniques while she personally owed more money than I'll earn in the next 4 years of full-time professional employment, I realized she wasn't just struggling with temporary cash flow issues or poor planning decisions. She was systematically deceiving everyone in this room, including herself, about the fundamental reality of her situation and her complete lack of realistic prospects for recovery, without massive family financial intervention. My father looked at me with an expression I'd never seen in his eyes before, a complex mixture of respect, pride, amazement, and something approaching genuine awe that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion and a sense of validation I'd been seeking for years. The next several hours were absolutely brutal and painful to witness and participate in. Uncle had to make a series of increasingly desperate phone calls to their financial advisor, investment manager, and accountant to discuss liquidating retirement investments, cashing out savings accounts, and selling other long-term assets to cover Victoria's debts before collection agencies could take legal action against the family or seize jointly held assets. Aunt spent hours on the phone with their family lawyer discussing potential liability issues, bankruptcy procedures, asset protection strategies, and the complex legal implications of having their names on some of Victoria's financial accounts and credit applications. My grandmother kept shaking her head in complete disbelief and muttering repeatedly about how something like this could possibly happen in a family that had always prided itself on financial responsibility, conservative money management, and teaching their children proper values and priorities. The phone conversations were devastating and heartbreaking to overhear. Uncle explaining to his investment advisor that they needed to immediately liquidate their entire retirement portfolio to pay for their daughter's gambling debts, systematic credit card fraud, and accumulated rent obligations. Aunt sobbing into the phone while talking to their lawyer about the realistic possibility of losing their house and the best available strategies for protecting whatever assets they might be able to salvage from the financial wreckage their daughter had systematically created through months of deception and reckless spending. 4 days after the emergency family meeting, Victoria finally made contact. She called Aunt's cell phone from a casino payphone in Atlantic City, where she'd driven using the last remnants of her available credit limits and a few $100s in cash she'd taken from her parents' emergency fund before disappearing. She'd been desperately hoping to win enough money through gambling to solve all her financial problems and return home triumphantly with a miraculous recovery story that would restore her reputation and family standing. Instead of the financial salvation she'd been counting on, she'd lost another $8,500 in 3 days of increasingly frantic and desperate gambling, maxing out her final credit cards on slot machines, blackjack tables, and online poker games while surviving on casino buffet food, and sleeping in her car in various parking garages when security guards forced her to move locations. She was calling from a payphone because her cell phone service had been terminated for non-payment weeks earlier. She was stranded over 200 miles from home with no money, no available credit, no friends or contacts willing to help, and no realistic way to return, except to beg her parents to send money for bus fare. A humiliating request that would require her to admit the complete failure of her last desperate attempt to solve her problems independently. Uncle had to wire her $400 through Western Union just to get her home, money they had to borrow against their house because their savings accounts and checking accounts had already been completely depleted, covering her other outstanding debts and preventing immediate legal action from the most aggressive creditors. When Victoria finally walked through the front door of grandparents' house 5 days later, she looked like a completely different person from the confident, arrogant young woman who had dominated Christmas dinner with her superior attitude and condescending financial advice. Gone entirely were the designer clothes, expensive accessories, and cocky posture that had defined her public persona and family image for years. She wore the same wrinkled jeans and stained sweatshirt she'd been wearing for nearly a week. Her usually perfect hair was greasy and unkempt. Her face was gaunt from stress and irregular eating, and her eyes had the hollow, desperate look of someone who had been forced to confront the complete and utter collapse of everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. Her white Lexus had been repossessed while she was gambling in Atlantic City, towed from the casino parking lot along with the few remaining possessions she'd left inside, when desperation drove her to risk everything on one last attempt to win back her losses. She'd taken a series of buses home, a 2-day journey of multiple transfers, uncomfortable seats, and the constant company of other people whose circumstances had reduced them to the cheapest available transportation options. The family confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in our normally polite, conflict-avoidant, and harmony-obsessed family culture. Victoria tried desperately to minimize the extent of the damage and create plausible excuses for her behavior, but I had documented everything far too thoroughly and professionally for her explanations to hold up under even basic scrutiny. Every lie was immediately met with printed evidence, bank statements, and recorded communications. Every excuse was systematically countered with specific financial records, documented transactions, and testimony from creditors who had been trying to reach her for months. She claimed the gambling was a recent development brought on by desperation and temporary poor judgment. I presented detailed records of casino rewards programs and online gambling accounts that dated back over 2 years, with transaction histories showing systematic losses totaling over $31,000 across multiple states and online platforms. She insisted the credit card debt was primarily from legitimate educational expenses and unavoidable living costs. I provided complete statements showing charges at luxury spas, designer boutiques, expensive restaurants, exclusive nightclubs, and vacation resorts that had nothing whatsoever to do with education or basic survival needs. She blamed her academic failure on unreasonably demanding professors, impossible academic standards designed to eliminate students rather than educate them, and a university culture that didn't support women in business programs. I had copies of the elaborate emails she'd sent to her parents containing fake progress reports, forged transcripts, and completely fabricated stories about academic achievements, internship opportunities, and job prospects that had never existed in any form. When she claimed that family pressure and unrealistic expectations had driven her to desperate measures, I showed them social media posts where she'd bragged about her expensive lifestyle, mocked other students who worked while attending school, and publicly ridiculed people who couldn't afford the same luxuries she was charging to credit cards. Finally, when every defense had been systematically dismantled and every excuse had been proven false with comprehensive documentation, she broke down completely and utterly, collapsing into the kind of raw emotional breakdown that strips away all pretense and reveals the terrified person underneath. "I just wanted to make everyone proud and live up to the family expectations," she sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of her emotional collapse. "Everyone always expected so much from me, and I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing you by admitting I was failing at everything I touched. I thought if I could just maintain the image long enough, I'd find a way to make it all real." The golden child facade cracked completely and irreparably, revealing the insecure, overwhelmed person who had been drowning in impossible expectations and her own sense of inadequacy for years, while desperately trying to maintain a standard of perfection that was destroying her financially, emotionally, and psychologically. That revelation fundamentally changed how I understood everything that had happened between us over the years, and it shifted my perspective on her cruelty in ways I hadn't expected. Victoria hadn't been tormenting me out of genuine superiority, natural confidence, or inherited advantages. She'd been systematically lashing out at the one family member who seemed to be making steady, authentic progress, despite having fewer apparent advantages and less family financial support. While I was developing real skills, earning genuine achievements, and building a sustainable foundation for future success, she was maintaining an elaborate and increasingly expensive performance that was always one missed payment away from total collapse and public humiliation. The profound irony of our situation wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The family member they'd all pitied, dismissed, and treated as the cautionary tale, me, with my thrift store clothes, unreliable car, and modest apartment, was actually the only one who was genuinely financially stable, developing valuable professional skills, and creating a realistic foundation for long-term success and independence. Uncle and aunt spent the next 2 months systematically liquidating nearly everything they'd worked to build over the previous 25 years to prevent legal action against their daughter and protect what remained of the family's reputation and financial stability. They sold their vacation home in the mountains where our family had spent countless childhood summers, cashed out their entire retirement savings plan that was supposed to support them through their golden years, took a substantial second mortgage on their primary residence, borrowed against aunt's life insurance policy, and even sold family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. The trust fund that was supposed to provide Victoria with financial independence and security for life was not only completely depleted, but her debts had consumed most of her parents' own long-term financial security and retirement planning as well. Meanwhile, I graduated from my accounting program with highest honors, completely debt-free, and immediately received multiple job offers from prestigious firms throughout the city. I accepted a position with one of the most respected accounting firms in the region, with a starting salary that exceeded what Victoria had been pretending to earn in her fictional career, comprehensive benefits that included health insurance and retirement contributions, professional development opportunities, and a clear path for advancement based on demonstrated competence and performance rather than family connections. The transformation in family dynamics was seismic and permanent. Suddenly, my parents weren't the disappointing relatives who needed to apologize for their modest achievements and limited financial resources. My practical approach to money management, education, and career development wasn't something to mock or dismiss. It was something to study, respect, and attempt to emulate. Victoria moved back into her childhood bedroom, sleeping in the same twin bed she'd used in high school, and got a job at a retail clothing store while attending mandatory financial counseling sessions, credit repair workshops, and therapy sessions to address the underlying issues that had led to her destructive behavior patterns. The golden child who had once delivered lectures about financial responsibility and wealth building was now earning $11 an hour while living under her parents' direct supervision, rules, and constant monitoring of every financial decision and purchase she made. 8 months later, at Easter dinner, I arrived in my first new car, a reliable Honda Civic that I'd purchased with cash from my signing bonus and first few paychecks. I wore a professionally tailored suit that I'd bought specifically for client meetings, nothing extravagant or showy but impeccably fitted, appropriate for my professional responsibilities, and genuinely elegant in its simplicity. The kind of investment clothing that communicates competence, stability, and success to colleagues, clients, and business partners. The same formal dining room that had witnessed my systematic humiliation at Christmas now hosted a completely different family dynamic and power structure. I sat confidently at the table, actively participating in conversations about career advancement, investment strategies, retirement planning, and professional networking opportunities, while Victoria remained mostly quiet and subdued throughout the entire meal, occasionally contributing to conversations but never with her former arrogance, condescension, or assumed superiority. After dinner, she approached me privately in grandparents' backyard garden, the same peaceful space where we'd played together as young children during countless family gatherings before our paths had diverged so dramatically, and our relationship had become poisoned by competition, resentment, and systematic cruelty. "I owe you a sincere and complete apology that's long overdue," she said, her voice heavy with genuine remorse, and what sounded like hard-earned wisdom that had come at a devastating personal cost. Not just for Christmas dinner and the specific things I said that night, but for years of treating you like you were somehow less intelligent, less capable, or less ambitious when you were actually the one making smart decisions and building something real and sustainable. I accepted her apology because I finally understood that her cruelty and systematic put-downs had never really been about me, my capabilities, or my actual worth as a person. Her behavior had been a reflection of her own terror of being exposed as a fraud, her desperate need to maintain an expensive image that was bankrupting her financially and emotionally, and her complete inability to cope with the growing gap between her public persona and her private reality. But something fundamental and permanent had changed in how I viewed my family and the importance of their opinions about my life choices, career decisions, and personal worth. The validation I'd spent years desperately seeking from these people no longer held the same power over my self-esteem, decision-making processes, or sense of personal identity. I'd proven myself not to them, but to myself, and that internal validation was infinitely more valuable sustainable, and meaningful than any external approval or recognition I could have received from family members who had consistently failed to see my actual worth and potential. 3 years later, I purchased my own house, a modest but well-built 3-bedroom ranch in an excellent neighborhood with good schools and strong property values. Nothing extravagant or ostentatious, but solid, comfortable, and genuinely mine, purchased with money I'd actually earned, saved, and invested wisely over time. Victoria was still living with her parents, slowly and methodically paying down her remaining debts while working retail and taking night classes at the same community college where I'd started my own educational journey years earlier. The irony of our reverse circumstances wasn't lost on either of us. The housewarming party I hosted was attended by my professional colleagues who had become genuine friends, college classmates who had supported me through the difficult years of balancing work and education, neighbors who had welcomed me to the community, and Mr. Rodriguez, who had become something of a mentor in real estate investing and property management. My family was invited to the celebration, but they seemed uncomfortable and somewhat out of place in my home, like they didn't quite know how to relate to the successful, independent version of me that had emerged from the struggling student they'd dismissed for so many years. At our most recent Christmas gathering, when we assembled around the same mahogany table, where Victoria had delivered her memorable lecture about financial responsibility and proper budgeting priorities, the roles were completely and permanently reversed. Now I was the family member with the established career, the house, the growing investment portfolio, and the genuinely bright future prospects. But the most important lesson I'd learned from watching Victoria's spectacular fall from grace had nothing to do with money, career success, or family dynamics. Real success isn't about impressing other people, maintaining expensive appearances that you can't actually afford, or competing with family members in ways that damage relationships and personal integrity. Genuine achievement comes from building something authentic and sustainable that can't be repossessed, taken away, or destroyed when external circumstances change, or when carefully constructed facades inevitably crumble under their own weight. I don't gloat about Victoria's situation, throw her past behavior in her face during family gatherings, or remind anyone of her humiliating predictions about my financial future and life prospects. I've never publicly mentioned her devastating comments from that Christmas dinner, or used her downfall as an opportunity to settle old scores or seek revenge for years of systematic cruelty, because I understand now that her behavior came from her own fear, insecurity, and complete inability to cope with the pressure of maintaining an impossible standard of perfection that was destroying her from the inside out. The most powerful response to someone who mocks your struggles isn't to wait for their downfall, or to seek revenge when they fail. It's to keep working steadily and authentically toward your own goals while they exhaust themselves trying to maintain unsustainable performances for audiences that ultimately can't save them from the consequences of their own choices. Sometimes the person delivering lectures about your financial management is drowning in debt they've hidden from everyone who loves them. Sometimes the family member who seems to have everything figured out is actually one missed payment away from complete disaster. And sometimes the best response is simply to keep building something real while they're busy performing for people who can't help them when the performance finally ends. The golden child crown that had seemed so important to our family hierarchy turned out to be made of fool's gold, impressive from a distance but worthless when examined closely. The real treasure was always the skills, habits, character traits, and authentic relationships that nobody could repossess, steal, or take away, no matter how dramatically external circumstances might change. Victoria is doing better now, slowly rebuilding her life on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. We'll never be close friends, but we've found a way to coexist peacefully at family gatherings without the toxic competition that once defined our relationship. And I've learned that the approval I once desperately craved from people who consistently undervalued me was never worth the price I was willing to pay for it. The only opinion that ultimately matters is your own, and the only success worth pursuing is the kind that allows you to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that everything you've built is genuinely yours and can't be taken away by changing circumstances or other people's judgments.